The Atari 2600, or as most of us probably refer to it as simply the Atari. When you think of Atari games, you might typically think of games like Space Invaders or Chopper Command, where you play the game, the difficulty gradually increases and increases, and eventually you just die. It was never really about beating the game, it was just about getting the high score to brag to your friends before, the dying happened. Some games technically did have a max amount of points. For example, River Raid keeps looping through the levels until you reach 1,000,000 points, then your plane just explodes and the game ends while your score changes to blah. But what if I told you there were certain Atari games that had actual endings, meaning there's a set amount of levels and maybe even a final boss or some sort of end scene? It's Atari 2600 games with real endings on this edition of Friday Night Arcade. Raiders of the Lost Ark was designed by Howard Scott Warshaw and released in 1982 by Atari, and it's been confounding gamers in the decades that followed. You play as Indy in a top-down perspective, and you have to navigate through various areas that are sorta loosely based on the movie. The market, forests, the Well of Souls, the Valley of Poison? Okay, so they took some liberties here and there, but you get the idea. While you navigate through, you'll have to avoid trouble from poisonous spiders, stinging flies, thieves, this one guy dressed in black that may or may not be the main Nazi from the movie, and of course, snakes. Ugh, why did it have to be snakes? At a glance, this would seem pretty straightforward, but it's just the opposite. This game actually has an inventory system, and you have to pick up various items along the way to help you out in your quest. You have to use 2 Atari controllers, one for movement and using your item, and the other for selecting or dropping items in your inventory. To say this game is cryptic would be an understatement. Some stuff sorta makes sense. For example, if you pick up the flute in the beginning of the game, you can select it to play a tune that charms the snakes so they won't be able to harm you. Or you can use the key to open up the Well of Souls and then select the headpiece to the Staff of Ra at just the right time to reveal the location of the Ark of the Covenant. Hey, now I remember that from the movie, but other stuff makes no sense whatsoever. Like, would you guess you're supposed to use a grenade in this first room to blow a hole in the wall to proceed to the next area? And the rooms in general don't even have marked doorways. For example, in the Room of the Shining Light, if any part of you touches any part of the walls, you immediately get put back in the dungeon, then you have to use your whip to escape. Yet the exit to this room is on the right side and you have to just know to push up against it to find a secret passage. Or if you try to move down from the market, you'll fall past a tree, land in the Valley of Poison, and then the flies will sting you and the Nazi will keep robbing you and eventually kill you. From the perspective of someone playing this in 1982, it had to be incredibly frustrating. Graphically, the game's about what you'd expect on Atari. Indy has his fedora, but when you try to use the whip, it's just a dot. Spider-Man's web shooter looks more like a whip than this does, and then when you find certain items in the game, there's really no telling what they are. You're gonna have to refer to the manual to see what's going on. Musically, the game plays a little snippet from the familiar theme song at the beginning, but otherwise there's not much sound here. I should also mention you can only hold a certain amount of items at any given time, so this can lead to a lot of backtracking if you don't know what you're doing. When you find the secret exit from the dungeons, you'll enter the treasure room, avoid the snakes, and pick up the gold coins to reveal a secret item. Actually, one of 3 secret items: an hourglass, a chai, or an onk. The only one you need is the onk, which you have to use as a grappling hook, which you'll need to move around the mesa field. And the only way to stop using the grappling hook is to drop it, which means you'll have to backtrack to grab another one after you figure out the location of the Ark and the Well of Souls, and you'll have to backtrack to make sure you have at least 3 pots of gold, 2 to purchase the shovel from the black market, and 1 to purchase the parachute from the regular market. And of course, if a thief touches you, he'll steal something out of your inventory, so at any given time you may have to backtrack to get the item again. Thankfully, they do respawn in the area where you initially found them. Technically, you can beat this game in under 20 minutes if you legitimately know what you're doing, but if you were playing this for the first time in the early 80s, you could expect to spend hours, probably days, and even weeks studying the manual, reading up on all the items and different rooms, and then just doing trial and error until you figure this thing out. Now, to be fair, you have to applaud the effort here to turn a popular movie into a unique adventure game that was unlike just about everything else on the console, and it's pretty cool that you can actually beat it by finding the Ark of the Covenant, but I wouldn't go out of your way to try to play this one now, except maybe as a mere curiosity. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Well, you knew I was going to have to get to this one sooner or later, so we may as well get this one out of the way now. At this point, you all probably know the stories and legends behind this game, so I'm going to skip all of that and just focus on the game itself. This was another game designed by Howard Scott Warshaw, and just like Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's frustratingly vague to figure out. You'll definitely need to brush up on the manual to figure out what you're supposed to be doing and what all the little symbols mean. So you play as E.T., and the sound effects when he arrives in the spaceship are actually kind of cool. Your goal here is to find 3 pieces of his interplanetary telephone like what he had in the movie so that he can phone home and leave Earth. The pieces are randomly strewn about the area in these pits that you fall into, and every time you play they're in a different spot, so it's not like you can even memorize their locations. After you fall into a pit, you press the button to extend E.T.'s neck and fly back out of the pit because that's a thing for some reason. This is awkward because oftentimes you end up getting stuck in a loop and just falling right back down in the pit again. Meanwhile, the whole time E.T. is being pursued by scientists and FBI guys that will snatch you up and take you away. You go to jail, E.T., you go directly to jail. We'll also take away your phone pieces if you've already collected any, and at that point you may as well just start over because if E.T. runs out of energy, he'll just keel over and die. So yeah, E.T. only has a certain amount of energy and walking around or floating drains it. You can replenish your energy by finding these Reese's Pieces candies scattered about the area, but you can only consume the candy if you're standing in a specific zone. That's another thing, every time E.T. moves around, he's moving across different zones which are indicated by this icon at the top of the screen. The arrows let you teleport to another screen. If you have enough pieces of candy, the manual says you can technically call Elliot if you're standing in the right zone and make him go find a missing phone piece. I guess while you just sit back and chill? It's complicated, and audiences thought so too. Technically though, it is possible to beat this game if you find all of the pieces and successfully phone home to get the aliens to come and rescue E.T. Unfortunately, only about 7 people in the history of forever have actually pulled this off since this game is about as much fun as Brussels sprouts. Did any of you ever actually beat this game? Well, now here's something you don't see every day. Riddle of the Sphinx was developed by Imagic and released in 1982. You play as the son of a pharaoh trying to save a kingdom from a vile curse. You have to travel across the Valley of the Kings in search of treasures that you need to appease the gods and solve the Riddle of the Sphinx. Yeah, something like that. This game is complicated. It's similar to Raiders of the Lost Ark with an inventory system, and once again you'll need 2 controllers to utilize items that you're carrying, and you can defend yourself against thieves and scorpions with a slingshot. You'll have to barter with nomads who occasionally give you items but may also steal from you if you're carrying too much stuff because it can't be that easy. The whole time that you're moving, your thirst factor keeps increasing, which causes you to move slower and slower and slower. You can top off your thirst by visiting an oasis or interacting with this goddess whose name I won't repeat because it will probably get my video red flagged or something. But don't try to interact with the god Anubis because you're totally not worthy and you'll take damage. As you pick up items, you can use them to interact with sacred sites like the Phoenix, pyramids, and several temples, including eventually the Temple of Ra. This is the final part of the game, and only the purest of offerings will appease Ra and cause him to paint the sky a special shade of honey mustard and save the entire kingdom. Okay, so you're supposed to do things in a certain order, and depending on which difficulty variant you're playing on, you'll have to use other items at some of the other sacred sites to get the necessary treasures you'll need when you approach the Temple of Ra. Also, your score will get dictated by the amount of treasures you bring, so I guess that's a reason to come back and keep playing. I told you this game is complicated, and just look at the manual. This game was way ahead of its time, and I totally admire the passion and grandiose ideas here, but maybe this was all a little too convoluted for a console that only has 1 button on the joystick. I mean, look, if Gary Larson has an IQ of 162 and he can't figure it out, what chance does a dope like me have? Wait, no, did I just beat the game? Next up, I'm going to run through a few games here that do technically have endings but have already been covered a bit more extensively in previous videos on my channel. I'll throw some links down in the description if you want to get a closer look at any of these titles. First up is Secret Quest. The game was released later in the Atari's lifespan, much later. It was released by Axelon in 1989 and was technically the last officially released game in the United States for the console. You play the hero trying to stop a horde of evil aliens by destroying their space stations. To destroy the space stations, you'll have to infiltrate each base one at a time, take out enemies and collect power-ups and special weapons along the way, and eventually set a self-destruct sequence to destroy the base from within. Then get the heck out of there before the whole place goes up. There are 8 bases in total that you have to destroy, with each one being more intricate than the last. The game even has an inventory system that you can get to by toggling the black and white switch on the console, and it also has a password system that lets you save your progress. It's incredible what they packed into this tiny Atari cartridge. Unfortunately, this game gets ridiculously difficult after the first couple of levels, so I've never actually seen the official ending. But if you ever wanted to play a game similar to The Legend of Zelda but for Atari and set in outer space, this is the game for you. Frankenstein's Monster. This is pretty much the only notable thing to come from the forgettably brief Data Age era of Atari games. You play as a nameless hero who must stop Frankenstein's monster before he escapes and wreaks havoc on the townspeople. Technically, he's the final boss. The gameplay is similar to Pitfall, although it mostly takes place on this one screen. You have to navigate your way to the bottom of the screen and pick up a stone, then navigate your way back up to the top, and use it to build a wall around Frankenstein's monster before he comes back to life. Along the way, you'll have to avoid ghosts, spiders, more spiders, and traverse these moving platforms. Once you get the stone back to the top, you'll have to fight your way through a bunch of annoying vampire bats before you can ultimately place it. You'll have to place 6 stones in total to completely trap the monster, and like any Atari game, the difficulty ramps up each time you place a stone. You also have a time limit. The whole time you're playing, these electricity blasts are coursing through the monster's body and slowly bringing him back to life, indicated by the green color filling him up. Hurry up before he comes back to life! If the monster breaks loose, you're treated to the most epic game over screen ever. Starmaster. This was one of my all-time favorite games, and it's still fun to play even today. The game places you in the cockpit of a space fighter, and you'll take on enemy ships from a first-person perspective. The goal here is to protect your friendly space stations, which are indicated on this special map screen. Yeah, this game actually has a built-in navigation computer that you can get to by toggling the black and white switch on the console. That's pretty cool. The space stations are represented by these special symbols, and the enemy ships are these little dots. So you'll want to warp to the area where the enemy ships are and then take them out. Your ship can also run out of fuel and take damage. For example, you can lose your shields or your weapons, and then you'll need to warp to one of your friendly bases to dock for repairs and refueling. You beat the game by taking out all of the ships in the sector, and there's multiple difficulty levels to keep you coming back for more. This is a pretty incredible space survival sim, and it's amazing to think that Activision pulled all of this off on Atari hardware. You could even take a picture of your high score and send it off to Activision to get a special patch. I wonder if I can still get one. Keeping with the space shooter theme, Star Raiders and Solaris both technically can be beaten. These games were programmed by Doug Neubauer and published by Atari in 1979 and 1986. Similar to Starmaster, these space shooters pit you against the evil Xylons and let you warp around the galaxy through special navigational charts, though it's a bit more complicated. Solaris in particular is crazy. The galaxy is divided up into 16 quadrants. Basically, the goal in each of these games is to survive long enough to destroy all of the evil Xylons, although good luck getting through either of these. They're really fun, but definitely not games you can easily just pick up and play. You'll really need to familiarize yourself with the manual and what you're supposed to be doing in both cases, but they're totally worth checking out, especially Solaris. It's easily the prettiest game on the Atari 2600 with incredible graphics. Sometimes vacations just go bad. This guy's wife was kidnapped by cannibals, and it's up to you to help save her before she gets lowered into a smoldering cauldron and cooked alive. No, really, it was even in the commercial. Jungle Hunt on Atari is a side-scroller, and weirdly it scrolls right to left instead of left to right. First, you'll have to swing through the jungle on these vines, then you have to swim through a river full of crocodiles, and finally you'll have to dodge these boulders and get past the final bosses, the cannibals themselves, in order to save your wife. Or is it your girlfriend? I don't know, maybe they weren't even that serious. The early working version of this game was going to feature a bare-chested hero who would have looked an awful lot like Tarzan. Too much so, according to the Edgar Rice Burroughs estate, who ended up suing Taito and forcing them to change several aspects of the game so it didn't quite seem so much like Tarzan. In the year 2089, the Earth is reeling after a giant comet slammed into the planet, leaving the world's population with radiation poisoning and the world's worst hangover. You play as a lone warrior in a race car tasked with delivering the vaccine to every city to cure the world's radiation sickness. At a glance, this looks a lot like Pole Position, but it's a bit more complicated than that. You'll have to race through 32 levels, and along the way you'll run into other cars driven by what the manual calls nefarious henchmen, who are out to try to kill you and take all of your stuff. So this is basically Mad Max Chunky Pixel Road. There are also obstacles like oil slicks, because every racing game has to have oil slicks, and there's also roadblocks that look like a ham and cheese sandwich. All of these little readouts and meters at the bottom of the screen have a purpose too, like armor, fuel, ammo, and so forth. You'll want to try to make it through as quickly as possible so that you can save more survivors at each city, because after each level, depending on how many survivors you save, you'll get more points to spend on repairs for your vehicle. There's also a variety of ever-changing backgrounds to keep things interesting as you go. If you manage to get all the way to the end, you'll get to launch a rocket that puts a satellite into space, which will save the entire planet. This game was released by Sculptured Software fairly late in the Atari lifespan, all the way in 1989, and it was released only in Europe. It uses an insanely large and expensive to produce 32K Atari cartridge, which is probably why it never saw a US release, although an NTSC prototype did exist, and the ROM did eventually make its way online. A much more polished version of Fatal Run came out on the Atari 7800, but still, it's impressive they even got this to work on the Atari 2600 at all. Adventure. Can't get much more simple than that name, but this is a surprisingly complex and well done game given the limitations of the Atari console hardware at the time. Okay, so the story here is an evil magician has stolen the enchanted chalice. It's up to you to find the chalice and return it back to the Golden Castle. If you make it back to the castle with the chalice, congratulations, you just beat the game. Sounds easy enough, but along the way you'll have to deal with locked doors, keys that are guarded by man-eating dragons that look like sea monsters, and these thieving little bats that steal all of your stuff. There are 3 difficulty levels, and the first level is pretty straightforward and thankfully doesn't have the bat. Pick up the sword, go and murder the dragons before they eat you, then grab the black key and go into the maze and find the chalice. But in the second difficulty level, the world's bigger, and this time the bat is there to really make things complicated by stealing all of the items that you need. And the third difficulty level randomizes the stage, so no 2 playthroughs are necessarily the same. This game would have a ton of replay value for its time. I realize this looks incredibly basic now, but you have to appreciate what went into this. Warren Robinett programmed this entire game by himself on an HF1611A microprocessor. Look at what's going on here for an Atari game. You're moving around from room to room, picking up items and dragging them with you. Sure, later games like Secret Quest and Raiders of the Lost Ark would add significant polish to their inventory systems, but Adventure came out a couple years before Raiders of the Lost Ark. Sadly, Atari typically refused to credit developers for their work on the game box, and this led to one of the gaming world's first widely known Easter eggs. There's a special hidden room within the game that contains Warren Robinett's name. Atari eventually found out about it, but it was way too expensive to reproduce all of those cartridges, so they left it in. Well, now here's one I completely missed. Private Eye was developed by Activision and released in 1983. It definitely has shades of Pitfall, another Activision title. So here's how this works. You play a detective Pierre Touche, because everyone is French in this game, I guess. You have to arrest this bad guy, Le Fiend, and take him back to the police station unscathed. But you guessed it, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's a case to solve here, and you've got to find clues. Yeah, they thought of that too. The manual reads like a criminal dossier. You've got 5 different cases to choose from depending on which difficulty level you select. In the first case, you have to find the gun and get it verified at the gun store. Then you have to find the stolen money and return it to the bank. And finally, after you've dealt with all the evidence, then you get to go find Le Fiend, arrest him, and get him back to the police station to beat the game. Along the way, you'll have to dodge birds, oil slicks, rats, falling bricks, and flower pots, and other criminals that throw knives at you. Thankfully, this isn't one hit and you're dead. There's a point system here and you lose points for taking damage. But if one of the criminals hits you with a knife while you're carrying the evidence or Le Fiend, you'll lose whatever you're carrying and have to backtrack to retrieve it. And that's another thing, you've only got 3 minutes to do all of this. The manual calls this the statute of limitations. I always dislike time limits like this though, but it forces you to do a couple things. You'll have to find and remember where everything is, and then make a mostly perfect run in order to get everything done in time. You can deal with the evidence in any order, but you can't arrest the fiend unless you've processed both pieces of evidence. And if one of the thugs knocks anything out of your hands, you may as well restart because you're probably not going to make it in time. With 5 cases to choose from, there's definitely plenty of replay value here though. This game isn't going to make any top 10 lists, but it's pretty cool what they did here nonetheless. Rounding out the list of games that can be beaten is Pitfall and Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns. I'll start with the first Pitfall, and this is one people have been asking me to talk about since forever. It's an all-time classic Atari game and one of the crowning achievements of Activision in the early days. Pitfall was developed by the great David Crane, who also did A Boy and His Blob, which I've talked about before in the past, and it was released by Activision in 1982. It went on to sell over 4 million copies and is one of the longest Atari games you'll find. Seriously, the sheer volume of area to explore is staggering given most Atari games only lasted a few minutes. There's 255 total screens to explore here. Most people think of Pitfall as being the first side-scroller, although technically Defender was released in 1981, and also it's not even really a side-scroller. The screens just load when you get to the edge. But still, the platforming and exploration elements was just something you didn't see on Atari at the time. Okay, so the story here is you play as Pitfall Harry. Your mission is to navigate your way through the jungle maze and collect all 32 treasures, which are scattered all over the place. Once you find the last treasure, the game freezes and you've officially beaten the game. Congratulations, the end. Along the way, you'll have to swing across alligator-infested lakes and holes in the ground while avoiding snakes, scorpions, and rolling logs. Also campfires. Seriously, shouldn't I put that out or something? So navigating your way around is a little weird. The underground passages are shortcuts. For example, if you take the underground passage to the right, you'll technically skip 3 screens to the right over, whereas if you took the path above ground, you'd have to traverse all 3 screens. The top area typically is the tougher path with all sorts of obstacles, while the bottom area is infested with scorpions. You'll need to keep track of where you're going though to find all of the treasures, and while all of this is going on, you're up against a ticking clock. You've got 20 minutes in total to find all 32 treasures while successfully navigating through the jungle maze, and that's why I've never talked about this game before. Truth be told, I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with this game. We had it growing up and I played it, but I never got very far in it, and with the ticking clock, I was always running out of time well before finding all of the treasures. To make matters worse, the play control of this game is wonky as all heck. I realize it's an Atari game, but jumping and controlling your movement is stiff as heck. Meanwhile, many elements of the game require absolute precise jumping and timing. You can't screw up at all. The game is designed to be ran through as quickly as possible, and yet sometimes, depending on how quickly you're moving, the ropes won't always be in the right spot when you enter a new screen, and you'll be forced to wait on them, or you'll have to stop and wait on a pit to open and close before you can run across the screen. Sometimes you can get on a roll and make it a few screens in a row quickly, but then you'll mess up and jump a quarter pixel too far on a crocodile head because the play control sucks and then you're dead. The hit detection ain't so great either. No matter how many times I think I've got the timing down on these scorpions, I still screw this up. You only get 3 lives too, no matter how many points you get. And really, 20 minutes is literally just enough time to make it through this game and find all of the treasures. And that's if you know the exact path to take. If you mess up and have to backtrack, you may as well start over. See, like here, I actually only have 1 treasure left, but I needed about an extra minute to get to it. Instead, the timer ran out and now I'm just done. So I guess I always hated that the game forces you to rush through it and basically make a perfect run at a rapid pace. With the precise jumping and stiff mechanics, it really feels like you should be able to kick back and approach this more methodically. Now, don't get me wrong, Pitfall is still a fascinating and monumental achievement on the Atari console. It just always has bittersweet memories for me. What did you think? Did you ever beat this one? And that leaves us with Pitfall 2 Lost Caverns, developed and released by David Crane and Activision in 1984, and well, pretty much all of my complaints about the first one are addressed here. The play control and jumping are tightened up quite a bit, and there's no time limit so you can explore at your leisure. There's also checkpoints, and instead of 1 hit and you're dead, if you get hit you just lose some points and go back to the last checkpoint you touched. Also, they did away with the confusing underground secret passage system that warps you 3 screens over, and instead you just have a static map to navigate through that looks something like this. At a glance, this seems simple enough, but it's actually pretty devious, and I'll get to that here in a bit. Okay, so the mission this time is to collect all of the treasure again, but now you've also got to save your girlfriend, Pitfall Rhonda, and, debatably more importantly, your loyal pet Quick-Claw the cat. Quick-Claw needs your help, man. The game even taunts you by showing you Quick-Claw right at the start of the game, but if you try to get him, this stupid rat just pushes you away. Looks like you're gonna have to take the long way around. Along the way, you'll have to navigate around scorpions again along with frogs, and this time there's bats and eagles that zip across the screen in specific patterns. Your only recourse is to move in just the right spot to pass under them. You can even swim in this game, and there's electric eels. I mentioned the map is devious, and it consists of 2 main shafts on each side that you'll have to navigate through, along with these 2 areas in the middle. Your path through should look something like this. There's treasure scattered about in each area, but getting to them all is, well, they just got totally mean. For example, as you're making your way up the shaft on the left to get to Quick-Claw, you'll see this treasure ring taunting you on the platform below. But there's no way to get to it from where you are. Would you guess that you're supposed to jump across the cavern from the other section and land on the edge so that you can get in here and collect this treasure? This game is full of all sorts of little nuggets like that. Thankfully, there's no specific order that you have to do everything in. The game will let you know when you find everything, so just keep moving. Also, there's water all along the bottom of the map, so if you're unlucky enough to fall in it, the only way back is to make your way all the way to the right and climb up this ladder that's dangling just above the current. But it turns out David Crane is actually kind of a jerk. There's a frog hopping back and forth at the top of the ladder, a bat fluttering across the middle of the screen where the ladder is, and oh, if you fall back into the water, watch out for the electric eel. The game totally punishes you for falling into the water, and you'll have to time this just perfect to get out. But none of that is a complaint really, just an observation. In all honesty, Pitfall 2 Lost Cavern is probably the greatest Atari 2600 game ever made. What other game lets you swim, ride balloons, and actually last longer than 5 minutes because the world is so big? Also, there's music. The cartridge has a special chip built into it that plays some nice tunes along the way. Did you ever find everything and beat this one? Well, that wraps it up for this week. What are some other Atari 2600 games that have real endings that you can think of? I know I'm missing some here. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please don't text and drive, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.